I'm sorry, my timer just got set to 3 hours and 45 minutes. I could do it. Tomorrow I'll be doing a workshop on the menace of white supremacy. And in that conversation, we're going to encounter a few extremely hateful terms you may not be familiar with. They include white genocide, race traitor, mongrel races, and race suicide. These terms and the horrible concepts they represent all have their origins in the USA. Some of the most hateful racialist and racist ideas that have abounded in the 20th century, including the lion's share of the racialist and racist ideas that animated National Socialism and the Nazi movement, were born in the United States. So we're going to talk about all of that. The ugliness arises from a white supremacist stew of ignorance, resentment, bad science. That's really important. Bad science. We're going to talk about that today. And perhaps most of all, identity crisis on the part of whites who imagine themselves disadvantaged, threatened, and delegitimized. I'm going to say today that race is a bogus concept, but I'm certainly not going to say that racism is bogus. It's very real. White privilege that Barbara alluded to is very, very real, extraordinarily destructive, and so on, but there are some reasons for hope. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow as we dismantle, and I promise we will, the idiocy of white supremacy. Today I'd like to say a few words, and I hope they're healing words, about the myth of race. But first, something about two poison trees. Those that were with me during the forum know that I brought up the idea that there are two poison trees that really, metaphorical trees, obviously, we don't have to go looking for them, root them out, but two metaphorical trees that together account for virtually everything that troubles us in our society today. All the really bad stuff, I believe, I'll be arguing, all the way through this set of workshops. I'm going to introduce the idea in every single one, but that there are two sources, two poison trees. White supremacy is one of them. One of two extremely destructive cultural forces, cultural influences that I'll be touching on in each one of my presentations. We're really going to go to town on it tomorrow, but it's going to pop up in the others. Absolutely, it has a lot to do with the conversation about what's going on Facebook. You know, Facebook is absolutely plagued by some of the ugliest trolling that you can imagine. And the centerpiece, the center focus is white empowerment, white supremacy, racism, and so on. We're also going to talk about Trumpism globally. And can you imagine for a moment that there's not a strong white supremacist heart beating there? Anyway, so that's one. The other of the two trees is, and this might surprise you, it's science denial. And it has sort of two parts. One is the denial of evolution, and that is a deliberate attempt on the part of the extreme right in the United States and now elsewhere to drag in evangelical Christians into the whole enterprise, the dubious enterprise of questioning science. Right? So that sets the stage for what's really the purpose of science denial, which is the denial of climate change. That is the centerpiece of the anti-science movement in the United States. The whole thing about evolution is just to make sure we get some white evangelicals, some Christian evangelicals, to join us in our ruinous assault on climate change. But there's one other element of bad science, of this anti-science tree, and that is the idea of racism itself. Anyway, together these two poison trees explain most of the worst that is disfiguring our culture today, and that includes racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia of all sorts, that just means fear of the stranger or of the other, xenophobia of all sorts, the vicious troll culture of the internet, fake news, fake science, fake religion. The alt-right movement. If you don't know about the alt-right, we're going to go there on Wednesday night when we talk about Facebook. What I'm really calling this workshop is Facebook, social media, and election 2020. Why worry? Don't worry, I'll give you plenty of reasons to worry. The modern conservative movement, and yes, Trumpism itself. This may sound like quite a reach to say that the global Trumpist phenomenon, and let's face it, the here Trumpist phenomenon, has, if you wanted to identify one single root, it is climate change denial. And that may surprise some of you, but maybe by the time we're done with this week, you'll be more persuaded. We'll begin that discussion tomorrow in the Menace of White Supremacy workshop, but you should know the good news that will inform every one of our conversations, and that is that both of these poison trees, each of these poison trees is absolutely unsustainable. Right? Absolutely unsustainable. Each must necessarily wane and disappear, and that is very good news indeed. So let's get with it. The whole question of race and ethnicity. Do you think, for example, let me just toss this question out. Don't bother to answer it. It's what we call rhetorical, which means zip it. I began my teaching career with 8th graders. That's all I have to tell you. Do you think that cuisine is genetically determined? What about dress? How about music, dance, and the arts? How about religion? You can answer now. Just say no. Well, of course not. Of course not. That worked. We'll do that again. All of these are ethnic and, remember this part, geographical traits. They're not genetic. Therefore, it makes no sense to call them racial. But on the other hand, does it make sense to talk about Korean food? Or, praise God, Mexican food? Or just about any ethnic cuisine that you ever came across has been worth getting to know. Are those real things? Yeah. Are they genetic? Of course they're not genetic. All right? They are ethnic, okay, but here's a much handier word. When somebody points to some trait and says it's genetic, think for a moment. You don't even have to think. Just counter them and say, no, it's geographical. It's not genetic, it's geographical. There's your answer. By the time we're done with this week, I think that will make more sense to you. Racial categories are defined much more by choices than by genes. What do I mean by that? The racial group or the ethnic group I choose to identify with. In general, we choose our ethnicity, don't we? What do you think? It's given? It's stamped on your papers? No, you choose your ethnicity. I read a very interesting story about, as a matter of fact, a Korean woman who was adopted very early. She is as Korean as could be. She has lots of Korean relatives, but she was raised in Italy. So what's her ethnicity? She says, I could choose Korean, but that wouldn't mean anything. My cuisine, my language, my geography, the people that I am closest to and so on, they're all Italian. I'm an Italian. That's my ethnicity. I choose that. Who chooses your race? Be assured, someone else. Someone else is assigning you to a race. The U.S. Census Bureau defines race as a person's self-identification with one or more social groups. By the way, there's a lot of pressure on the U.S. Census Bureau to get rid of race as a category. Let me just cut to the chase a little bit here and say, if we were to query the great majority of working geneticists, anthropologists, students of culture, and people who write and talk about the idea of race, one thing we'd hear from all of them is that it is a made-up category. It's a made-up category. Now, I know for some of you, you're hearing this for the first time, and you're going, well, that can't be true. You know, I've known about race, and I've known what race I was, and I've known what race everyone else was. from the get-go. So just entertain this idea for a moment and see if it begins to work for you. Encyclopedia Britannica, this will bring in the doubters. I don't know. Encyclopedia Britannica says, race is the idea that the human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical and behavioral characteristics. That's the idea of race. But genetic studies in the late 20th century refuted the idea, the existence of biogenetically distinct races, and scholars now argue that races are cultural interventions. Think about that. Cultural interventions reflecting specific attitudes and beliefs that were imposed on different populations in the wake of Western European conquest beginning in the 15th century. We began sorting the world into convenient races. And once you've begun the sorting, it's inevitable that you begin mapping what we call the concordances. In genetic studies, in so-called racial studies, we talk about concordances. That is, once I've identified the race of a person, and how do I do that? What are the markers I look for? Skin color, right? Hair texture, and certain facial features. That's all I got to go on, right? But then I presume there must be concordances. And what are the concordances? Well, that race should concord with, it should be in concordance with, it's just a technical term that's stuck in that discipline, it should concord with intelligence, athletic ability, susceptibility to disease, body size, weight, height, and so on. You should be able to say a whole bunch about a person once you've identified her skin color. Turns out that none of that is true. Skin color has zero predictive ability when it comes to IQ, disease susceptibility. And here's one that always throws in, this is the one where I get the most argument. People say, what about athletic ability? Everybody knows that white people can't jump. White people can't jump because they hang around with other people who can't jump. It's as simple as that. For race to have meaning, it has to be more than skin deep. Just think about that. For race to have any meaning at all, it's got to be more than skin deep. For race to be more than a typology, right? A typology is just let's say that there are so many races, and let's see. We'll divide them up according to, skin color. That would be a typology. But for race to be more than a typology, it's got to have some predictive power, right? I got to be able to take that person and say, wait, don't tell me anything about yourself. Let me tell you about you. Let me tell you what your IQ is likely to be. Let me tell you what your interests are. Let me tell you how skilled you are musically. And boy, can you people dance. You know, the thoughtful recipient of a compliment like that would say, that's not a compliment because it's not true. I got so many relatives that can't dance a lick, right? Of course, it still doesn't explain my brother, who is white, and he can't dance enough for 1,000 people. If you followed that, he can't dance enough to cover the requirements of not dancing for 1,000 people. In other words, skin color needs to reflect things that are deeper in the body, under the skin. Do you see what we're getting at here? Race is only skin deep. Now, is there truth to the fact that we vary in terms of skin color? Yes. And most of the systems that have argued for racial typologies, we're going to talk about one of those tomorrow, which divided Europeans into 3 races. The first was the perfect race, called the Teutons. Later, that name was changed by someone we're going to meet, and I understand there's someone in the room who knows about this fella and has read some of his pernicious stuff. The guy's name is Madison Grant. And Madison Grant, who was writing about eugenics, the eugenics movement, and was a progenitor of early white supremacy and organized racism, wrote a book called The Passing of the Great White Race, which Hitler identified over and over again as his Bible. Nazi racialist and racist ideas were born here, not there. Anyway, the races that were identified by Grant's predecessors and by him were the Nordic race. He changed that Teutonic identifier after World War I. That had a little bit of baggage, changed it to Nordic. The next race were the stocky but workmanlike Alpine group. And oddly enough, the Alpine group included all the Slavs. This is a very catch-as-catch-can classification. And then the swarthy, always the word swarthy, which meant not only darker of skin, but also generally untrustworthy. Do you know that until the 1950s, Time magazine used the adjective swarthy in a kind of reflex way to refer to people that were sketchy, as my daughter would say, or iffy. Anyway, I'm sorry, where was I here? But Madison Grant, who said there are these three races, there are the Nordics, there are the Alpines, and there are the Mediterraneans, the swarthy Mediterraneans, also said, and then of course there are the black races, And he says, and you know, those races, those hardworking but not too bright Alpines, those kind of shifty but suitable for laboring jobs, Mediterraneans, they're always being manipulated against the interests of the Nordics. And who do you suppose is doing the manipulation? The Jews, right? So that was Madison Grant's picture of racial characteristics. But most of the people that talk about race would say, yeah, you know, we probably divide into about 5 skin colors. But here's a really interesting exercise that I want to share with you. Let's see, I'm sorry. The idea of race assumes that there are set boundaries between the races. But we know that to be untrue. You know, there's no racial boundary that's ever been found. Any trait that one looks at, one tends to see gradual variation from one group to another, not sudden or abrupt variation. Like you leave this group behind and all of a sudden average IQ just plummets, right? As soon as you cross that imaginary racial line. But the facts of human variation, the fact of human variation is that it is continuous. The word that is used in these studies is clinal, C-L-I-N-A-L. And clinal is, a weather map is clinal. It varies, temperature varies. It doesn't vary abruptly, but it varies very, very gradually as you move from one place to another. One of the ways this is what I wanted to share with you, one of the ways to begin to see a different paradigm, to see that the world isn't really divided into 3 or 4 or 5 types of individuals, is to really try to locate those individuals, to find them and locate the racial boundaries between them. We're divided into 4 or 5 types. I'd like to find those 4 or 5 types. So I'm going to go looking and see if I can find them. Do this as a thought experiment. Start off, for example, in northern Scandinavia. Say northern Finland. Take a walk in your mind. You don't have to actually do this. Take a walk in your mind through Scandinavia, perhaps into Germany, down through Germany into southern Europe, through the Mediterranean, perhaps circle around till you get to Algeria, into northern Africa, and continue on your way down toward the equator, and from the equator to South Africa. The challenge would be to say, where does one race begin, and where does another race end? You understand, this is impossible. It's a fool's errand. Can't be done because those differences, those distinctions do not exist. Perhaps The challenge would be to say, where does one race begin and another end? Or even, where does dark skin begin to show up again? In fact, what you find is a rather subtle gradation in skin colors. This is called clinal variation. And again, it's really kind of like what you see in your weather maps of temperature in your home region, or your 11 o'clock weather forecast, where you can see how temperature grades change ever so slightly as you go from north to south. Well, skin color is actually quite the same thing, right? It varies clinally, which is to say continuously, as we move from north to south. Reach the equator, darker, begins to lighten up as we move farther south. And remember that what we call race is only skin deep. Race is only skin deep. There's nothing racial under the skin. Race stops at the color of your skin. I could say it about 11 more ways, but my point was to say it 2 or 3 ways. And you know what that means? It means that in the long run, and perhaps much sooner than we might think, racism and white supremacy must prove unsustainable. One last little paragraph. What is non-concordance, and what does that tell us about race? For race to have meaning, I'm repeating a line here, for race to have meaning, it must be more than skin deep. For it to be more than a typology, it has to have concordance. I'll give you an example of concordance. Height is actually quite concordant with weight. Does that make sense? As your height increases, your weight increases, right? As we get taller, we gain weight, we have more weight. One aspect of size is concordant with another aspect of size. But most all of human variation, if you take away nothing else, take this. Most all of human variation is non-concordant. Skin color or eye color or hair color is not concordant with height or weight. And they're definitely not correlated with other more complex traits like intelligence or athletic performance. There is absolutely zero evidence of concordance between what we think of as the racial markers, skin color, hair type, and facial features, and those other patterns of variation. Those things evolve and develop, I'm almost done, in extremely different ways. Just as skin color develops in different ways from size, intelligence, athletic performance, other traits develop in different and independent ways. A map of skin color gradients, let's say, looks just like a map of temperature. It gets lighter as you go toward the poles and darker near the equator. But then take a map, say, of the distribution of blood type A, right? Looks entirely different. There's no relationship between the two maps. Take a map of IQ. No relationship between the two maps. You cannot discover concordance. Simply, why? One is not related to the other. Almost done. When we adopt a racial view, we have to see a concordance. Right? If we don't see it, what do? We absolutely make it up. Whoever said that, that's a 10-pointer. Yeah. And with that 10 points and $10, you can get yourself a Starbucks. We have to make it up, because if there is no concordance, there's no race. We have to see a concordance between IQ and skin color. Otherwise, there's no meaning there. There's no there. There's nothing under the skin. Race stops at the color of your skin. But as I said at the beginning, do not imagine that I don't believe in racism. I absolutely believe in racism. I believe in white supremacy, but I believe that racism is based on bogus science, although it desperately tries to quantize and quantify itself with science, but the science is made up. I definitely believe in white supremacy, but I also believe that white supremacy is like the other poison tree, I'm going to talk about science denial, unsustainable. If there's no such thing as race, pretty soon you're going to run out of ways to be a white supremacist.